Okay, that should be up. Thank you, everyone. I'm going to hear a fair bit from me today. So yes, the work I'm presenting is actually led by Dr. Abby Scott here in our Tropwater team. Myself and Sky McKenna, Len McKenzie, Norm Duke, Adam Canning, and others in Tropwater, as well as a whole host of partners. I really want to acknowledge everyone from the Reef Authority and the Marine Monitoring Program, Seagrass Watch, Cape York Water Partnership, as well as Ports North in terms of contributing meaningful data to be able to get a real understanding of impacts from Tropical Cyclone Jasper. We have already acknowledged the traditional owners, but I do want to take a minute and acknowledge those that are part of the work that we're doing and on the lands where I am today here in Irukandji and Jabagai country, and acknowledge elders past, present, and emerging for their continued work to manage sea country. So Tropical Cyclone Jasper, for those up here quite familiar with the path it took, it was only a Category 2 cyclone in December 2023. No one thought much of it as it was approaching the coast for many locals. And then it stalled. It stalled and became a significant rainfall event. Many places in the region, especially up in the Bloomfield and Daintree area, received over 1,000 millimeters of rainfall in 24-hour period in an area that had already been saturated by rainfall leading up to that event. From that, the plume and sediment laden waters that ran out were sitting off the shelf for days. So the impacts were not just in those immediate areas, but all the way down through Cairns and south of Cairns and further north. So quite a significant impact, considered a 1 in 1,000-year flood event. This is from some of our survey work. You can see the landslides. I mean, there are hundreds of landslides that are dotting the mountain line. It's incredible, really, to fly past firsthand, I must say. It's really just restructured the entire landscape up there. So the objectives of this project were really to understand the true impacts of Tropical Cyclone Jasper on marine intertidal and subtidal habitats on the core area of impact, which is from that sort of Cairns region up to Cooktown. Documenting also in the 2-year program that was funded both by the state government, as Damien pointed out at the start, as well as through NESP, to look at possible recovery over that time and identify any opportunities, if there were some, for rehabilitation or intervention strategies to prevent further loss. This also was an opportunity to update very depauperate coastal information. These areas, of course, otherwise haven't been surveyed for quite a long time, and I'll get to that. So a chance to update that data. And importantly, a priority for us was working with the traditional owners on their sea country and to help build capacity through this project on the on-ground activities and surveys that we were doing. Finally, this is really getting to the sort of end of the project, was looking at how this on-ground data can hopefully inform or update, validate models, particularly around seagrass probability and remote sensing work in this region through this data set. So in terms of the key habitats that we're really targeting is mangroves, of course, coral, and seagrass. We're collecting everything in between in terms of interreef and benthic communities, but these were really the core focus of this project. The mangrove work was led by Adam Canning and Norm Duke. Their surveys were looking at mangrove health, areas that were impacted, and looking at sort of severity and also where the impacts originated from, and those types of impact. In terms of the coral surveys, of course, looking at the extent of impact where we could. Also looking at sort of functional group level information, given the area we needed to cover. We weren't going into very detailed surveys, but at least capturing that information on the coral communities present. And looking at key health metrics in terms of disease, bleaching, and other components of the benthic community. Also goes for seagrass, looking at extent, how much in terms of how much abundance or biomass, percent cover. It varied depending on the program, whether we were drawing from some of the long-term monitoring programs in the area or through sort of our rapid survey methods that we used. And of course, looking at species mix or composition, and also looking at biologically important areas or condition and use of these seagrass habitats by dugong and turtle. I'm just going to start and talk through a bit of the mangrove work by Adam and Norm. So this was done as aerial surveys, so helicopter surveys. You can see on the map there were done on that red line. We did luckily have previous surveys that they had done in 2017, so it gave us a great sort of pre-Tropical Cyclone Jasper baseline or reference point compared to the post-impact surveys. The 2025 work was really focused around the highest affected areas, which was the Daintree and Bloomfield systems. And as I said, they were looking at not only the sort of climatic impacts, but also sort of those human impacts and trying to measure and score the severity and extent of those. Lots of photos. I just want to point out the top line. Again, these are from the Daintree and Bloomfield systems as the highest impacted areas. These top ones are from those 2017 surveys. So fairly healthy mangrove systems by and large, sort of intact riparian vegetation. You can see in that image under the Bloomfield there before Jasper as well. And of course, down the bottom, you're seeing quite a bit of impacts. In the bottom left, you're seeing some of that banding dieback, which is really related to sediment deposition that's come down through the river systems there in the Daintree, as well as direct impacts from that immediate sort of flood damage that you're seeing in that second photo in the Daintree. There was a lot of bank erosion that occurred as well in the Bloomfield, as well as at the mouth. You can see in that far right photo quite a bit of dieback there just from the immediate flood impacts and the huge amount of waters. Just a little more on some of that banding work that they were looking at. So sediments often will, when coming down in these sort of large swaths like this during a major flood event, they tend to lay out and get kind of locked into sort of those banding patterns where you get heavy deposition of sediments that really are burying their root systems, which of course acts sort of like a snorkel for breathing. As those roots are sort of smothered, they start to decompose, and the sediment actually drops and becomes more, you have further inundation and sort of smothering or basically being submerged for prolonged periods in salty waters, making recovery harder. Furthermore, that sediment actually over time actually can up and move through each subsequent wet season. So the concern is that original damage can persist for some time and many years later. This is some of the Sentinel-2 satellite imagery that they were able to go back and look at some of that pre-tropical cyclone footprint of mangroves and compare that with sort of that 0 to 3 month window post Jasper for the immediate acute effects. And they did look at this not only in Bloomfield and Daintree, but further down in that Cairns area of the Trinity Inlet and Russell Mulgrave systems. But by and large, you can see that 90 hectares was lost in the immediate aftermath in the Bloomfield, where closer to 600 hectares in the Daintree system. Following 12 to 24 months later, and we look at those same footprints, we're seeing that we actually had cumulative losses still in the Bloomfield, up to nearly 100 hectares, where you did see some mild recovery, which they relate to some sapling growth in the Daintree. So there was some mild recovery at this early point in time. Of course, comparing it to those Trinity and Russell Mulgrave systems, there's very minor damage overall that they were able to detect. That's why there's not been a huge amount of focus going forward in those systems. So I'm going to shift gears now to the broader sort of intertidal and subtidal inshore marine habitats that we were surveying. And I think the first thing is to go, well, what do we know before Jasper? Not a whole lot. This map shows quite a few dots. This is from our synthesis layer that our team produced back in 2018. Basically all the sites where surveys had occurred for seagrass and other benthic communities since the early 80s. So much of this data, even if you zoom in, is quite sparse. So covering fairly large areas, kilometers, and having, you know, single dots representing huge stretches of the coastline. We do have areas, of course, in the Cairns Inlet where the port's long-term monitoring program occurs, as well as some of the marine monitoring program work out at Low Isles and Yule Point. So there is areas where we have a bit of information to go on pre-Cyclone Jasper, but by and large, this coastline has been poorly surveyed for some time. In terms of how we do it, just to quickly touch on, I mean, these are our classic sort of approaches that we use to cover large areas quite rapidly. So in the helicopter at low tide, hovering and recording information about everything that we see in the benthic community, and in terms of also measuring within quadrats for those kind of key metrics that we need to collect around seagrass, but looking at, as I said before, about the coral community and different functional groups that occur there. In addition to the helicopter surveys that we did both in 24 and 25, we also, of course, did all of the subtidal surveys using a drop-down camera and providing, you know, similar view with a live feed backup to the deck, where we're able to record similar information as well. And of course, all this work, importantly, was with traditional owners that we were working with. We had the Jabal Rangers up with us over a number of days, and also from the other groups in the boats. So we did also conveniently find some drone footage. Colleagues, many of you might know, Johnny Gaskell, off his own interest, decided to be recording prior to Cyclone Jasper some of these inshore incredible coral communities that still were thriving in years just prior to Jasper. So we had some great footage to go off of up on the sort of Daintree area at Thornton Beach, just north of Cairns at Wongetty, and further south near the Yarrabah community at Conjura Beach. So we were able to send him back out to those locations to collect sort of post-Jasper impact results. So we had some really, at least a few spots where we could say something about direct impacts from Jasper. Overall, from these surveys, we covered over 1,200 sites each year across the region. Most of our work didn't quite go all the way up to Cooktown. While we did do some surveys in Cooktown, the traditional owners just weren't ready at this point in time to do some surveys north of the Jebel Bina Indigenous Protected Area, which is what the sort of northern limit that you're seeing on those maps is. And just to add to those sites, we of course had our Ports North contribution of over 700 sites on the seagrass meadows in the Cairns Harbor as well. Together with the other really important contributions from the long-term programs with the Marine Monitoring Program, Seagrass Watch, and Cape York Water Partnership up around the Bloomfield area, it really provided some opportunities to say something about prior to Jasper and the long-term trend that we really couldn't capture in this two-year program. So as just a snapshot of the overall footprint, we did surprisingly, I think, find high diversity even in the immediate 12 months following Jasper, with 9 species present, and that was in both years. So despite just the little bit of green that you can see on that 2024 image, I'll zoom in a bit in a minute so you can see some of those fringing reef top seagrass meadows as well. Overall, there was about 3,500 hectares mapped in the first year. And of course, that huge expansion was offshore in the deep water meadows in the second year, as well as the inshore meadows. It really occurred in both. But the vast majority of the extent was contributed from 19,000 hectares in those deep water meadows, which kind of excitingly for us was made up of an endemic species, Halophila trichostata, which dominated this area. It's a species that's endemic to the Great Barrier Reef region and was quite expansive in the largest area that we've recorded of this species in our monitoring programs. And just to zoom in a little bit to give you a better idea of what this looks like between years, you can see some of those reef top seagrasses right there on the shoreline, as well as a large difference in seagrass expansion, both in the shallows at the Hope Islands and in that deep water, larger patch offshore. And also down just south of Bloomfield, the Wudjil community, we went out and looked at that Kangichi Beach. You can see sort of in the south. So that's going to be a meadow that we're going to have a closer look at longer term, we hope. And just to kind of move down, it's just to give you a little bit of a snapshot of some of these areas between years. Off Port Douglas here, this is sort of this sort of elbow here in Kuya Beach. There's some really exciting seagrasses that we were seeing not only in the first year, but in year two, which in year two, we were able to see some really nice use of this area with dugong feeding trails and spotted a mother and calf just offshore, which was really nice to see, given the state of impacts and seeing this kind of happening and not so long following Jasper. Moving again further south, this is the Ewell Point Meadow, which there's also the Marine Monitoring Program Seagrass Watch sites that occur here. We were able to record a much larger extent than that program is able to monitor as part of its program. But the great thing with that, the Marine Monitoring Program, is seeing some of the details that sort of mimic our data, but also give us that longer term snapshot of seagrass cover going back to the early 2000s when they set those sites up. I know that they've scored the most recent surveys and seeing the same sort of recovery and bounce back is doing fairly well considering where it dropped to following Jasper. Now, the final thing that we're just getting into, I just wanted to highlight was, again, looking at this data and how it does compare with some of the seagrass probability models, which were produced as previous NESP projects, which were incredibly important to look at the broader likelihood of seagrasses in the region outside of where we actually have survey data. And I think there's opportunities that we're starting to look at where the model maybe had missed that there's likely to be seagrasses. It did very well offshore in those deep water meadows, but as you zoom in inshore, you can see that we've started to fill in some important gaps where it was not predicted to have seagrasses and other areas where it was expected, and we have yet to pick that up. So moving on to coral. So the coral surveys, a bit more of a sad story, to be honest. We actually, on the fringing coastal reefs, we did not see a single living coral colony. There was also no other filter feeding clams or anything else. The amount of mud that was smothering those inshore reefs was incredible. It really took a hit, as you can imagine, for the freshwater kill and the mud smothering that's impacting those areas. And I'll show some footage in a minute. In addition, of course, the inshore island fringing reefs, those were very much impacted on the leeward side, so the river-facing fringing reefs of those areas. Whereas we did see that there is some healthy coral communities still persisting on that more windward side due to sort of a shadow effect of the islands. And that's the same in the marine monitoring programs. Just to show you what some of this looked like along the coastline, all those orange dots in the map are the sort of mud smothering as we recorded it at the sites. But you can see a real difference in terms of the coral structure. So the vast majority of these reefs likely to have died back from previous disturbances. And you can tell that by the amount of erosion that had already occurred. There was no sort of intact corallite structures to suggest this was recent. Some areas, such as off Kuya Beach, that's that bottom image, very much did seem to be like recent dieback. When you zoom in and look really closely, you can see that intact corallite structure. So there hasn't been that erosion. It's clearly been mud smothering on top of those sort of mounding colonies that you see in that image, which is quite sad. Also to look at some of the footage from Johnny Gaskell, those top photos are just increasing zoom in as you go right on those inshore reefs, which you can see before. These photos are up off the Daintree at Struck Island at Thornton Beach. Incredible coral cover up to 100% prior to the event, and post again, pretty much no coral cover persisting in any of his imagery. Wangeti Beach, just north of Cairns on the way to Port Douglas, is the same. So you can see that sediment shift in that sort of zoom out image well and truly, and the dieback of corals. So that was just April prior to the December 2023 event. And down even farther south of Cairns, so significantly removed in some sense from the immediate path and major rainfall event, but the freshwater kills persisted at Kundra Beach as well, where it was incredibly healthy coral cover there. This is actually GMY's sea country and loss of all of their coral life on the inshore reefs. I will zoom in just on a couple of little pieces because I know I'm going to be running out of time. This is Snapper Island. So our surveys provide, again, a bit of a rapid but larger footprint of information compared to the long-term marine monitoring program. That bottom image is showing, you know, as you can see on that sort of southern side of the island, which is really directly at the mouth of the Daintree system, there's really no coral cover practically left, whereas there's still significant corals and patches to the north side of the island. And that really does match in. This is the marine monitoring program. Tony and Avril Ailing continue to monitor those reefs at Snapper, where you can see the complete dieback of the reefs to the south. And the north side, they have still somewhat healthy coral communities, especially at that 5-meter contour, and potentially some slight recovery even since the event. Further south at Double Island, again, you can see similar things where we have quite a bit of loss on the reef tops and the shallows at Double Island, where there was, we know from anecdotally just from living locally, quite a bit of coral still there in recent years, and that's been completely lost. There is some fringing again to the north, and just to show you what those kind of coral communities look like, which are sort of plating and branching dominated, whereas off to the fringing areas, more encrusting communities. And you do see some real sediment and rubble zones in the shallows up on those areas that have lost all of its coral. The last thing was just to touch on next steps. So I did want to highlight that we have been able to secure funding for the state government because, importantly, especially for the seagrasses, 2 years really isn't enough to be able to understand the dynamics and possible recovery of these meadows. So while we have 2 years, we're able to continue this together with those traditional owners and build their capacity to hopefully build some long-term monitoring in at sort of these 4 key meadows up and down this coastline, and also start looking importantly at sort of the food web. So we're working with Biopixel Oceans Foundation to start mapping using stable isotopes the use of these inshore seagrass communities and looking at some megafauna movement patterns as well. So just to summarize, mangrove loss was significant in the Bloomfield and Daintree systems. In terms of recommendations and work, I didn't get a chance to highlight, but there is some bank stabilization work happening in these areas, and I believe some mangrove restoration trials are being considered at the minute and getting underway. For seagrasses, we really did have poor regional scale information prior to Jasper to say much about the true impacts from that event. But we do have some positive signs and that long-term data that allow us to have some understanding of the likely impacts there. And we're going to continue to look at monitoring recovery. But at this stage, we just can't say that we recommend intervention activities for seagrasses until we have that longer trajectory of data. And lastly, of course, the coral loss was significant with no signs of recruitment on those fringing reefs. And to be honest, quite unlikely that interventions on those coastal fringing reefs would be really possible. I know that there is some considerations out around low isles and places where they're trialing potential interventions at the minute. But I think that's yet to be fully determined. And with that said, I will close there. I'll stop sharing. Thank you.